Hi, this is Congressman Tom Cole in 4th District, and this is another one of our weekly chats. It's been an eventful week here in Washington, D.C. We were reconvened into session, the first time in the history of the United States using proxy voting on the floor of the House of Representatives. I tell you, I regret that very deeply. I think it was an enormous mistake for the House to allow it. We hadn't done it in 231 years. A lot of us think it's unconstitutional not to meet and do the work in person. I respect people that have another point of view, but that matter is actually going to be litigated. And honestly, we should litigate it before we actually start passing legislation that then may be challenged because we've done it in an unconstitutional way. I think more concerning long term, though, for the institution itself is the fact that just as I and others predicted, once you make this available, members quit coming to work. 2 weeks ago, when we voted on the so-called HEROES Act, only 12 members were not present in the House of Representatives to cast their vote. I'm sure they all had legitimate health or travel reasons why they couldn't be here. This week, however, 77 Democrats chose not to show up to work, including 27 from the largest state, California. Now, that to me is really a very dubious thing. The reality is you're supposed to be physically unable to come here, and yet the coronavirus situation has actually gotten better in the last 2 weeks, not worse. Travel options have gotten better, not worse. It's hard for me to believe we go from 12 to 77 members that can't show up. So I think when you look at the facts objectively, you know that we can function if we take appropriate precautions. I'm certainly in favor of social distancing, using a mask except when you're speaking, actually making sure you wash your hands regularly, all those sorts of things, limiting the number of staff that are here, limiting the number of visitors who are here. But the members can and should be here. The United States Senate has been functioning all this time with its members showing up and doing their work. The executive branch is showing up and doing its work. Millions of Americans never stopped working at all. Quite frankly, thank goodness for them, because they've kept the rest of us fed, made sure that we had essential services, and watched over us. Our military has stayed on guard around the world while dealing with the coronavirus. Given all that, I find it hard to believe the Congress of the United States and its members can't show up and function appropriately with some precautions. So I regret that. I think in addition to the voting change, we've got some important work done together. We're passing a very important modification of the Paycheck Protection Program that'll provide a longer period of time for businesses to actually spend that money. We'll provide additional flexibility for the individual businesses. And we'll try to make the program, if you will, more user-friendly and give the business more options as to expenses that they can actually pay under this, and a longer time to repay the loan if it's not all discharged by spending the appropriate amount of money maintaining the workforce. So that's a good thing, and broad bipartisan agreement on that. There was a second area where there wasn't bipartisan agreement, the so-called FISA Act, or Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. This is a very controversial measure that divides both parties. And it's a delicate balance between, on the one hand, protecting the individual liberties and freedoms of Americans from unreasonable surveillance and search, to, on the other hand, making sure that we have the tools to protect ourselves against another 9/11 style terrorist attack. As many people know that have followed this closely, there's considerable controversy around FISA, and it appears that the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act was misused in 2016 and 2017, and the Trump campaign was inappropriately surveilled. That's not just my opinion, that's the opinion of the Inspector General, who was an Obama-era appointee. That's also the opinion of many civil libertarians who are not particularly sympathetic to the president, but see this as a gross violation of the political process. Congress has labored. We tried to prove this and build in additional protections. At the last minute, however, a compromise couldn't be reached. The president indicated that he was going to veto the bill. And so while a majority of Democrats favored it, and certainly some Republicans favored it as well, the current piece of legislation that was going to be presented had no chance of being adopted. In addition, a couple of the amendments that would have provided additional protection for individual Americans did not make it into the bill. That's unfortunate because I think they would have made the bill better, and they were actually very bipartisan. You had very conservative Republicans working with very liberal Democrats to actually ensure that individual liberty is protected in all cases. The fact that those amendments weren't made in order, I think, pretty much doomed the bill. Doesn't mean, by the way, that we need to stop working on this. We do need to continue to work on it. The foreign intelligence surveillance courts need to be reauthorized, but we clearly all agree there need to be additional protections for American citizens and additional ways in which those sorts of decisions, which are made in secret, where literally the person being surveilled does not know they're being surveilled, that there's protections to make sure there's no abuse where American citizens are concerned. So we're going to keep working on it, but we clearly haven't reached the appropriate compromise yet that can pass both the Democratic House and Republican Senate and be signed by the president. Although to be fair, again, it's not a partisan issue. There were each party had lots of people on both sides of the issue. So we're really just struggling to reach the right place. Finally, of course, we continue to wrestle with coronavirus, and the news there is a little bit better than it's been. I do think we'll have additional legislation on that, probably in the second half of June or in the month of July before the August break. There are discussions underway as to what that should be. Each side are putting things on the table that are important to them. Democrats particularly championing help to state, local, and tribal governments. Republicans wanting to make sure there's liability reform in there. And I think Republicans wanting to incentivize people to go back to work as opposed to stay out of the workforce. So there's going to be a pretty robust discussion, I think eventually a compromise. And I hope we return to what we did the first 4 coronavirus supplementals. That is, work together with very little partisan dissent once we reach an agreement and actually go to the floor. So that's good news. On the disease front itself, most of the country in one way or another is beginning to reopen. It looks like we're having progress made against the disease. The number of cases and deaths are declining. This is another point, by the way, which is worth noting. People seem to think it's worse here than it is in other places. On a per capita basis, actually more people have died in the United Kingdom, in France, in Spain, in Italy, in the Netherlands, in Belgium. There's quite a few countries that have actually been hit worse than us, including developed countries. And over the longer term, I'm very afraid that countries like India, some of the countries in Africa that have less robust public health services than we do will probably be hit really, really hard. We're certainly seeing that in South America right now as well. So that means we need to redouble our efforts on finding vaccines and developing therapeutics to actually treat the drug. There's good news on both those fronts. We finally have at least one drug to use in this fight. I think you'll see more in the course of the summer. And I think we're, moving more rapidly toward a vaccine than we ever have before. There are more tests going on, more resources being put at it. We're actually in the field with human tests a lot faster than was anticipated only 4 to 6 weeks ago. And as we learn more about the virus, it appears to mutate less than we originally thought. That makes it much easier to develop a vaccine for it, and that vaccine to be effective for a considerable period of time all over the world. So we're going to keep working on this as we reopen the country. And hopefully the two parties can find common ground on this. Again, we did 4 times in a row in about a 10-week period. We didn't last week, but hopefully in the next few weeks we will. So we're going to continue to work to try and get through this and make sure that we can restore our economy, that families can be safe as they go about their business. And again, folks can go to the workplace and return with the certainty that hopefully they don't get ill. We do the appropriate things. If they do, that we've got the appropriate therapeutics to give them the help that they clearly need. So we'll look forward to visiting with you next week. I think Congress probably won't be back in session for a couple of weeks, at least the House won't, but the Senate will be, and I'll look forward to visiting with as many of you as I can when I'm back in the 4th District of Oklahoma.